If you were watching the first segment of this course, you heard me talk about the fact that the Portuguese reconquered the eastern part of Brazil, and the 2,000 Jews who were living in Pernambuco had to leave for fear of the Inquisition. They went to a variety of other places in the Caribbean area, Dutch possessions primarily, and occasionally British possessions. Some of them went back to Holland, and others went elsewhere. We'll talk about them in a minute. The British territories were more hospitable in the New World than they were actually in the United Kingdom. You may remember that I talked about Manasseh ben Israel and his attempt to convince Cromwell that the Messiah would not come until Jews were readmitted to England. Well, no Jews were allowed to come into England during his time, but shortly thereafter, Charles II did during the Restoration. And as you can see from the map, Jews entered various other islands. Barbados was probably the most significant of them. Suriname certainly was a very important area. Now, the Jewish exodus from Brazil, from northeast Brazil, involved a number of ships that carried Jews away. One of them was called the St. Catarina, St. Catherine, or in English, the St. Charles. And in 1654, probably in mid-September sometime, the ship left Pernambuco. Among the other passengers, there were 23 Jews on board. It was a rather small ship, not a very big one. And its route hugged the Caribbean islands, went across the straits to the coast of what would eventually become Florida, and then up the east seaboard as far as New Amsterdam. They put in at New Amsterdam in October because they were partly afraid of the weather, and partly because it was very possible that they had run out of money. Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Amsterdam, and he reported to the Dutch West Indies Company in Amsterdam itself. In 1655, shortly after the Jews arrived, he petitioned his company to allow him to expel the Jews. Why did he do this? Well, he probably didn't like Jews in the first place, but more important, he didn't want commercial competition, and he was afraid that they would place demands on the community's charity for support. He also wanted religious homogeneity in his new colony. This was very medieval. It was very much like what we had learned about Spain in the previous lecture. His petition was rejected by the Dutch West Indies Company. Now, they had had some previous experience with this because the Jews who went to Barbados had also petitioned the British West Indies Company to allow them to stay. And the British West Indies Company wrote to their governor and made a very strong case for Jews being allowed to stay. Basically what they said was, we have learned through research that when Jews are allowed to do commerce freely, it is good for business, and we make money. And so you are commanded to allow the Jews to stay, provided that they support themselves, take care of their own charity cases, and do not cause any religious trouble. So when the Dutch West Indies Company had this precedent, they said basically the same thing to Stuyvesant. Now, there is a belief in some quarters that a number of the stockholders of the Dutch West Indies Company were Jewish. There probably were some, but it was a very small minority. The decision of the Dutch West Indies Company was certainly not based on the pressure of stockholders and investors. It was based on self-interest. They were pretty aware that the Jews who were able to settle and do business in New Amsterdam would bring profits to the colony. This was pre-modern capitalism at work. So in the letter to Stuyvesant, they told him to allow them to stay and freely engage in commerce, to worship privately, and not to be able to tap into the Community Charities Fund. Well, in those days, charity was always given through churches, and so they were not members of the Dutch Reformed Church, and they wouldn't have qualified for charity anyway. I want to read you an excerpt from the petition of the Jewish community of Amsterdam to the Dutch West Indies Company, telling them why Jews should be allowed to stay. This is what they said. Now listen to the various explanations that they give for why they should. There are many of the nation who have lost their possessions at Pernambuco and have arrived from there in great poverty, so that your petitioners had to expend great sums of money for their necessaries of life. We had to support them. And through lack of opportunity, all cannot remain here to live. They can't stay in Amsterdam. And as they cannot go back to Spain or Portugal because of the Inquisition, a great part of the aforesaid people must in time be obliged to depart for other territories of their high mightinesses, the States General and their companies, in order there, through their labor and efforts, to be able to exist under the protection of the administrators of your honorable directors, observing and obeying your honors, commands, and orders. It is well known to your honors that the Jewish nation in Brazil have at all times been faithful and have striven to guard and maintain that place, risking for that purpose their possessions and their blood. We fought for this place. We gave up a lot for Brazil and for Dutch interests. In a sense, you owe us. Yonder land is extensive and spacious. The more of loyal people that go to live there, loyal people, the better it is in regard to the population of the country, as in regard to the payment of various excises and taxes which may be imposed there, and in regard to the increase of trade, and also to the import of necessaries that may be sent there. In other words, it will be good for profits. Now, in addition to the Dutch self-interest, it's important to note that the British and the French were in the process of building worldwide commercial empires at this time. And they had already, in Martinique and Barbados in the Caribbean, admitted Jews. The Dutch were interested in this experiment of letting Jews trade, and they were not about to be left out. If Jews could live in Dutch, in British, and in French possessions, then maybe it was worthwhile letting them live in our possessions too. That was their reasoning. I want to take a moment to just digress a second and talk about a major theme. Throughout these lectures, we're going to be looking at two things: acculturation and assimilation. Acculturation is how you keep your own identity, but use some and adopt some of the cultural aspects of the majority civilization. Assimilation is when you become like the others. We are going to look at how Jews attempted to define a boundary between keeping a Jewish identity and becoming part of American society. There are many choices, and they found many different paths. For the first time in post-biblical history, outside civilization did not impose limits on what was possible. This was really a new world for Jews. To illustrate how new this world was, let me tell you that a year after the Jews settled in New Amsterdam, in 1655, there was a call for burghers, citizens, to mount guard on the city's wall. Now, where was the city? The city went up to the northern wall of the city. That place is today called Wall Street, for the reason that it was the wall. Why were they guarding the city? Not because of Indian attacks. That was the least of their worries. They were worried about fire. The city was built almost entirely of wood, and a fire would destroy virtually everything before it could be put out. So the idea was that you had people walking along the wall at all hours to watch for the slightest indication of a blaze. If they saw that, they yelled, "Quick, fire, fire," and people came out and tried to extinguish it. 2 Jews, Asser Levi and a friend of his, were called up to serve. But Stuyvesant said, "No, I don't trust Jews, and I don't want you to serve. You have to pay a certain amount of money to buy a substitute." Well, it's probable that Levi and his friend couldn't afford that substitute. But more important, they wanted to assert their rights as burghers, as citizens of New Amsterdam. And so they wrote another letter to the Dutch West Indies Company, and a letter came back again and said to Stuyvesant, there is no reason why these 2 men shouldn't be allowed to watch the city. And so this was an early example of asserting Jewish rights, and in Yiddish we call it chutzpah, sort of a nervy attitude of saying, I can do this and you can't stop me. Now, in 1776, a few years later, we think there were approximately 2,500 Jews in 6 major American communities. Remember that the British North American colonies included Canada at that time. So we start on the north in Montreal. We work down to Newport, Rhode Island, New York, and Philadelphia, and then Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Each city had a certain number of Jews. Nobody had more than 500, maybe 700 Jews at the most in New York. And each city had a scattering of Jews living in the outskirts, a diaspora around, small towns not far, maybe 20, 30, 40 miles outside of the city. For example, in Philadelphia, if you had a boy child and you wanted him to be circumcised, there was only one ritual circumciser, a mohel, in the entire area. And he was on his horse, frequently going to various small communities. Sometimes he was in Philadelphia, but you couldn't rely on the 8th day, which is the commandment in the Bible. So you did whatever you could to make it possible to circumcise your son as soon as possible, as soon as he got back. These Jews were involved often in petty manufacturing. They made shoes. They were tailors who made clothing. They rolled cigars. They made bedding. And sometimes they explored the wilderness. Aaron Hart, for example, lived in Three Rivers, Quebec, he and his 3 sons, and they traded with the Indians. He sent his sons back to England to get married to Jewish girls, but they all lived in this small town in Quebec. One of my favorite stories is about an unknown man in Montreal who apparently was a very obnoxious fellow. And every spring when the ice melted, he would leave the community and go into the backwoods to trade with the Indians. As soon as he left, the congregation in Montreal would expel him from membership. But then he came back in the fall. He probably had spent the summer cohabiting with squaws, with Indian women, and he probably hadn't bathed all summer. But he had something more important. He had a tow of canoes full of skins, pelts, and he had a lot of money. And so every fall, around the high holy days, they readmitted him to membership. I guess things haven't changed so terribly much. Two other fur traders in Philadelphia were Moses Levy and his son Haman. And they were the early employers of a man that you may know by other lights, John Jacob Astor. The Astor Hotel in New York is named after him. In Newport, Rhode Island, two Sephardic Jews, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera and Aaron Lopez, had a company called the United Spermaceti Candle Company. Now, that was named after sperm whales. And they had a fleet of ships that went around the world whaling and collecting the oil of sperm whales. They made candles and they made all kinds of other things, including using the bones of whales for stays in women's girdles and dresses. Unfortunately, when the British blockaded the port of Newport during the Revolutionary War, their business was completely ruined. There was relatively little anti-Semitism during these days. Life for the Jews in North America was as free as it had been ever since the destruction of the temple, the last 2,000 years. There were not a lot of Jews, and so they were not a threat, even though people may not have liked them very much. We know that Harvard University, Yale, and a few other and most other colonial universities taught Hebrew. And at Harvard, they actually advertised for a Hebrew teacher and found one, but the condition of his employment was that he convert to Christianity. That was in 1638. Gershom Mendes Satius was the reverend. He wasn't a rabbi, but he was the person who served as a rabbi of Shereth Israel Congregation in New York. And he was on the board of King's College, which eventually became Columbia University. Chaim Solomon in Philadelphia was a financier who helped pay for the American Revolution. And you will find a statue of Chaim Solomon in Jackson Park in Chicago, along with George Washington and Robert Morris, the first secretary or a secretary of the Treasury, and the man who was responsible in large measure for the American financial system. The Gratz family of Philadelphia were merchants and land speculators. The French and Indian War had caused American soldiers to be paid in land warrants, promises of land west of the Appalachians. But most of these soldiers really didn't want that. And so they sold them off for a small fraction of their value. The Gratz family accumulated a lot of land warrants, but they wanted to know what they really had. And so they hired a surveyor. That surveyor's name was Daniel Boone. And that's how he got west of the mountains. He moved into the Kentucky and Tennessee area to survey their land. Rebecca Gratz, the daughter of the Gratz family, was a raving beauty, and we've got a picture of her that would pretty much demonstrate that. It is reputed that she was the model for Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, and she was a very philanthropic woman and helped start the first Sunday school. She was involved in art and the Female Benevolence Society and the Orphan Society. You might also want to know about a fellow named Michael Meyer Myers. Meyer Myers was a silversmith, and he also worked in pewter. He was the American equivalent of Paul Revere. And in major museums, Meyer Myers has some of his items are displayed. My favorite Myers items are in a display case in Shereth Israel Congregation on Central Park East in New York City, and Central Park West. They are two bells that go on top of the Torah. And he was such a patriot that when the revolution was declared, he went in and crafted these bells in the shape of the Liberty Bell to show that the Torah and American liberty are linked together very tightly. They're really beautiful. And he was a consummate artist. In fact, most Jews were in tune with the revolution. Relatively few were Tories who went back to England or sided with England. So next time, we're going to talk about the religious life of these Jews in North America in the very early days. And I hope you've enjoyed this short talk about how Jews got to North America.